For anyone who's out there, we'll be starting the webinar in about 9 minutes. So please hold on. Dan Kelly, if you're on the line, would you just shoot me an email to let me know whether you can hear me and whether the slides are up? Dan, got your email? Just checking again. Is the audio level just fine? Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? And why don't you also send a question in the chat box? Thanks. For people who are dialing in, we'll be starting the webinar in about 7 minutes, so just hang on. Thanks. For those people who have joined the webinar, we'll be starting in about 5 minutes. So just please hang on. We'll be starting right at 1 o'clock Eastern time, about 5 minutes from now. Thanks. Again, for people who are here for the webinar, we'll be starting in about 3 minutes. So just keep holding. We'll be starting right up at 1 o'clock East Coast time, about 3 minutes from now. Thanks. For everybody who's listening in for the webinar, we'll be starting in just about a minute, so just please hang on. And for Dan Kelly, I did get your chat, so we're fine on the chat box. Well, it appears to be about 1 o'clock East Coast time scheduled for the start of this webinar. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Oxenford from the law firm of Wilkinson, Barker, Nauer in Washington, D.C. I think we've got broadcasters from Michigan and also from the state of Utah who are taking part in the webinar today. Welcome to you all. I'm here joined with my crack paralegal, Tracy Taylor, who's sitting next to me. Tracy, why don't you wave in the camera there?
Hello.
Tracy's an expert in all the FCC's electronic filing systems, and so she'll be talking about some of the issues about filing in the new filing system that you'll be using for the biennial ownership reports that are due on March 2nd of this year as we go through the webinar. So again, welcome to everybody who's joined us here this afternoon. And why don't we get started talking about some of the details about what you need to know on these broadcast ownership reports due on March 2nd. These electronic broadcast biennial ownership reports due on March 2nd. We'll talk a little bit about who needs to file these ownership reports, which is essentially all broadcasters, including non-commercial educational broadcasters for the first time. We'll talk about the new LMS filing system and how it works, how it's different from CDBS and the systems you may have used for filing applications at the FCC in the past. We'll take a look at some of the questions that you may be asked that may be a little bit more confusing than some of the others, some of the details of the information that the FCC is seeking on these ownership reports. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the fees that you need to be filing with these ownership reports if you're a commercial broadcaster. And we'll be going through the forms themselves, particularly the commercial broadcast biennial ownership report form, looking at some of the questions, giving you an idea of what these forms look like if you haven't already been into the system to check them out. So let's talk a little bit about the background of the biennial ownership report. Basically, every 2 years, the FCC asks all full power broadcasters to file a biennial ownership report. And this is required actually by Congress so that the FCC can assess ownership of broadcast stations, basically put together a database of who owns what stations and who has interests in what stations and what cross interests particular individuals or companies or financial institutions may have in different broadcast stations. And that's so that broadcasters can assess diversity so that the FCC can assess the diversity of ownership in the broadcast medium, looking at minority and female ownership in particular, but just generally discussing or assessing diversity of ownership in broadcasting. In this new LMS system, the idea is to make the system more automated, to provide the ability to search by owner to find out what cross interests they may have, as every attributable owner, and we'll talk about what that means in just a moment, will just show up if you search them in this LMS system, or at least theoretically, that's going to be the way that it works after the ownership reports are filed. This is the first year, though, that non-commercial stations are part of the same process. Non-commercial stations had not been part of the commercial biennial ownership report filing process, but instead filed separately on the anniversary date every other year of the filing of their license renewal applications. About a year ago, the FCC decided that non-commercial stations should be part of the same cycle so that the FCC would have a snapshot of ownership at the same time for all full power stations, commercial and non-commercial. So they've now folded non-commercial broadcast stations into the same biennial ownership report process as commercial stations. These reports are supposed to be filed on December 1 of all odd numbered years, but because the FCC moved the filing into this new LMS system, they postponed the December 1 filing deadline until March 2nd. Should have been March 1st, but that's a Sunday, so they pushed it back to March 2nd of this year to give the FCC time to get the LMS system up and running and to give broadcasters time to figure out how to use that LMS system. However, even though the report is postponed until, that says March 1st, but actually March 2nd, the effective date, the date that you're supposed to use for the information that you provide on these ownership reports is October 1. That's supposed to be the snapshot date. The FCC is looking for who owned what as of October 1 of 2017. So when you're filling in these reports, even if you've had some minor changes in ownership since October 1 of last year, you still got to report on the ownership as of October 1 of last year. If you sold a station at some point after October 1, you still have to pretend like you own the station as of October 1 and file a biennial ownership report for that station that you owned back on October 1. If you bought a station since October 1, you don't have to file an ownership report for that station that you acquired after October 1. The old owner should be filing that report, even if they've gotten out of the business. If you've looked at any of the assignment application grants that have taken place since October 1, you'll note that there is a special condition on those grants of the assignment applications that say that the old owner is required to file an ownership report, even if they've sold the station at some point after October 1. So again, remember when you're filling out the information about what who owns what on the ownership reports, that information should be accurate as of October 1. So what gets reported? Generally speaking, and we'll look at the specific questions in a few moments, there'll be some general information about the filer of the ownership report. That will be, for instance, the licensee of the station will need to put in its information. It'll need to provide a contact person at the station, or sometimes a station's attorney, somebody that the FCC can call with questions about the ownership report. The attributable owners of the licensee will be provided with their race and gender. In a normal ownership report that you file after an acquisition, when you put a new station on the air, that doesn't have race or gender, but every 2 years, the FCC asks for these biennial ownership reports that do ask for race and gender of the attributable owners. Where the attributable owner is not a person, but it's a corporation or an LLC or a trust or some other sort of organization, you have to file a separate ownership report for that parent company, as the FCC calls it, and go right up in that ownership chain until you reach a real person to report, so that the FCC again can gather race and gender information about the folks who are owners in broadcast stations and figure out who owns stations going up the chain to their ultimate individual owners or control parties. You'll also, in the past, you had to report on other broadcast interests. Technically, you're not going to be filling out information on the new reports that specifically list all the broadcast interests that you have, because you'll be providing FRNs for all the attributable owners. All the ownership information for those owners will supposedly be, once these reports are filed, searchable by individuals, so that anybody coming in saying, what does John Smith, who's checked that he's got other broadcast interests, have? They'll look up John Smith, they'll look up his FRN, and they'll find a list of all the ownership reports on which he appears that will give them the other broadcast interests that John Smith has. You will, though, have to report on other newspaper interests if you do have any cross-ownership interests with a local newspaper, because newspapers themselves don't file ownership reports. Therefore, you have to file those newspaper interests on this biennial ownership report. And then the FCC also asks for contracts related to ownership and control, and we'll talk about some of those specific contracts here in a moment. So when you're reporting on attributable owners of a broadcast station, who are you reporting about? What people do you actually need to talk about? Generally, we're talking about voting interests. And in fact, in a corporation where you may have some non-voting shareholders, you're talking about essentially the voting shareholders in a corporation. In fact, there's even an FCC rule that says where there is a single majority shareholder, somebody that owns over 50% of the voting shares of a company, you don't have to report on the other shareholders of the company, because, hey, that 50+% shareholder controls the company because he votes the majority of the stock. However, you do also need to report on the officers and directors of a corporate licensee, even if you have a single majority shareholder. If you've got a station that's owned by an individual, you report on the individual. That's an attributable owner of that station. If you've got a general partnership, the partners in a general partnership are the attributable owners. If you've got a limited partnership, generally you're reporting about the general partners in the limited partnership. Now, technically speaking, that limited partnership has to have some insulating language in its organizational documents. That insulating language has been set out by the FCC in a number of reports and orders that basically says, hey, the non-voting limited partners in this limited partnership don't have any day-to-day say in what's going on in the partnership. They can't replace the general partners on a whim. They basically don't have control rights in this limited partnership, and there's some very specific language that the FCC has provided to what they call insulate these limited partners from attribution, so that you don't have to report the limited partners on these sorts of ownership reports or in any other FCC filings. So make sure if you've got a limited partnership that you've got this insulation language in your organizational documents, and then you don't have to report on the limited partners. The same thing with an LLC. Generally, we're talking about the managing members who have voting rights in how the LLC is managed and how the interests that the LLC has are run. Those are the people that you're reporting on who have the attributable interests in the LLC. Again, though, you have to have this insulating language that insulates all other LLC members who are non-managing members from control over the organization. Again, there's magic language that the FCC has spelled out that you should have in your LLC agreement so that you don't have to report on non-managing members of an LLC. If we've got non-commercial licensees who are on the webcast, generally we're talking about the board members and the officers of a non-commercial licensee, particularly those officers who have control rights with respect to what's going on at the broadcast property. There is an opportunity to insulate board members who have no control over broadcast operations, but that's something that you should be talking with your own station attorneys about if you're going to try to get a board member insulated and take him out from being reported on the Biennial Ownership Report. The ownership report that we'll be looking at in a few moments also asks for certain contracts to be specified in the Biennial Ownership Report. Those contracts are basically contracts that deal with ownership or control over the entity that owns the station or over the programming that is broadcast on the station. These will be things like organizational documents for the entity that owns the station, like articles and bylaws for a corporate owner. Usually it would be LLC agreements for an LLC. Documents related to current or future ownership or control of the station, like option agreements to purchase the station at some point in the future, pledge agreements that govern what happens to voting rights in the event certain issues arise with the financing, for instance, of the station. Voting proxies that give somebody's votes to somebody else in connection with voting their interests in the stations. All those sorts of agreements need to be provided. Oftentimes, these documents will arise in connection with a financing agreement with a bank or another financial institution. And in fact, some financial documents that don't specifically address ownership issues may still put limits on what you can do with respect to the operation of a station. They may say you can't sell certain assets without approval of the lender. You can't change the format of the station without approval of the lender. You can't get rid of certain key employees without the approval of the lender, or something along those lines. If you've got a security agreement that doesn't otherwise affect voting rights, but puts these operational restrictions on what you can do with the assets or operations of the station, then you probably have to file those security documents with the FCC as well. Certain TV programming affiliation agreements, basically network affiliation agreements, need to be filed if the network provides at least 15 hours of weekly programs to 25 stations in 10 different states. So essentially that's the big four TV networks. Those agreements need to be filed with the FCC. there's a requirement that you file citizens agreements. Probably nobody's got a citizens agreement. They used to be very popular 20 or 30 years ago when petitions to deny license renewal applications were filed by lots of citizens groups. And often to settle these cases, stations entered into agreements by which they agreed to provide time to the citizens groups to run some public affairs programs addressing issues of importance to those groups, or that the station itself agreed to run particular programming addressing the issues that these citizens groups found important. Those seem to have disappeared over the last 20 years. So you'll probably not see citizens agreements or not have citizens agreements that need to be reported. Management agreements that provide that the manager shares in both the gain and the loss of the station. In other words, where they've got a percentage interest in the gain, the profits of the station, and also in kicking in money whenever there's a loss of a station, which again will routinely not be provided in your standard management agreement. There may be some upside for a manager who does a good job, but rarely is a manager going to be kicking in money to cover the losses. But if you've got a management agreement that provides both, you got to report on that. Also, LMAs and JSAs need to be reported with broadcast stations. Now, you may have seen that the FCC is looking at whether some of these documents can be filed with the FCC with redactions, blanking out financial information and other business-sensitive information, LMAs and JSAs. That is already provided by the rules. Many licensees have redacted other documents listed here that you're supposed to be filing with the FCC and listing on these ownership reports. The FCC is looking at whether this informal practice of redacting some of the sensitive information should in fact be made formal, or at least that's a proposal that will be considered at their FCC meeting later this year. So look for how that changes. So that's some of the basic background issues of what we'll be looking at when we actually look at the FCC forms. So let's look at some of the forms and some of the FCC pages that you'll be looking at as you begin to prepare the biennial ownership reports if you haven't already done so. So one of the first steps is getting an FRN for each attributable owner who you'll be reporting on the ownership report. So Tracy, why don't you talk a little bit about this page that broadcasters can find on the FCC's website about how to get an FRN.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay, so the first step that you will need to do once you are on the FCC's website is you will click the link that is called CORS, which is the page you see here. And the thing to do is assign yourself a username. And the username can be anything that you like. It can be Twinkies or your dog's name. So you would enter that in the username box, and then you would give yourself a password that you can remember to use to log in. Once you've done that, you click the login button, and it will take you to the next screen.
Right. You'll be able to find the CORS database on the home page of the FCC. There's a box up on the top that talks about databases and systems, I think it's called. You pull that down, and CORS, the commission registration system, will be one of those options. So that's where you get to this CORS registration page.
Exactly. So once you're, like David said, once you are on this page and you've given yourself a username and password, you would have entered into the CORS system. You're letting the system know that you now want an FRN. So once you click the login, you'll go to the next page. And at the next page, you will see all the pertinent information that you need to enter. You need to tell the system whether you are an entity or an individual, whether you're a corporation, if you're registering for the licensee of the company that you're filing the ownership report for, you would obviously check entity. Or if you are an attributable interest holder, you would check an individual. And you would also answer the following questions about whether or not your contact address is in the United States. Yes. And then you would hit continue.
Right. So again, looking at this question, if you're an entity, that basically is going to be if you've got a corporation, an LLC, a limited partnership, a trust, any of those, you're going to need an FRN number for that entity, plus you're going to need an FRN for each attributable owner in each of those entities. So you'll be getting an FRN for those entities by checking entity, and then an FRN for each of the individuals who have attributable interest by later coming back and checking the individual box and getting an FRN for those individuals.
Right, and just to make it clear, you have to repeat this step for each interest holder that you need an FRN for. So you may have to do it one time if you're just doing it for one attributable interest holder, or you may need to do it 10, 20 times, depending on how many interest holders you have.
Right. So if you've got a complicated ownership structure with lots of folks up the chain, where your licensee is owned by another parent corporation, which is owned by an LLC, which is owned by a couple of individuals, you're going to be you'll be back on this page 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times to get FRNs for each of those entities up the chain and for the individuals who eventually hold the interest at the top.
Correct. So on the next page is where you tell the FCC the specific information about who you're getting the FRN for. The entity type, for a corporation, the options would be for a private sector. Where it says entity type, there's a drop down, and it'll give you choices on the types of entities you can get an FRN for. And then you would select which one applies to you. Right.
You see right here on this example on the slide, it says federal agency, but if you do a drop down, it says private sector. And that's what everybody, unless you're a federal agency who's on this call, likely everybody's a private sector reporting entity, so you'll pick that.
And for entity name is where you would put your company name that you're applying for the FRN for. Now, if you're applying for the FRN for an individual person, you would just enter your name there. And on the next line, you would enter, if you're getting an FRN for your company, the next line you would need to enter the tax ID number for that company in the space provided. And if for some reason you do not have a tax ID number yet, there are options that you would need to tell the FCC the reason you don't have a tax ID number.
But again, for most of you who are already operating stations and paying payroll, you're going to have a tax ID number that you'll need to provide that will help you that'll lead to you getting this FRN from the FCC.
Okay. So you go further down the form.
Should we talk about individuals?
I'm sorry, yes. Yes, and the individuals, after you enter your name, you would enter your last 4 digits of your Social Security number on where it says taxpayer identification number. You don't have to enter your full 9 digits anymore. You just need to do the last 4 digits. So once you enter that, you would follow the contact information. And if you have an attorney who's going to do this for you, that's where you would enter their information. Their position would be obviously attorney, or if you have an in-house person who's going to take care of this, whatever their title may be. And the only other information you need to the only other information you need to complete are the information that has the red asterisk. So salutation, first name, last name, you really don't need to fill that information in. You just need the address, city, state, zip code, phone, and email. And all of that is in case the FCC needs to ask you a question about your FRN or something that you entered on this form.
Right. So when you're picking a contact person, make sure you're picking a contact person who is going to answer the phone when the FCC calls or respond to an email when the FCC sends an email. Don't just pick some engineer or somebody who's going to be off at the transmitter site most of the time and never gets around to responding to official looking correspondence, or don't put in the name of an owner who is semi-retired and living in Florida most of the time, who only checks his mail once every couple of months, because if the FCC's got a question, you want somebody who's going to be there to answer the FCC's question about the ownership information that you've provided.
So this is what the screen will look like once you've been assigned an FRN by the FCC. It'll tell you the time that you registered for it, and it'll also give you the number. You'll see it's grayed out there, but that's where your number would show up. And you would need to print this page out and keep it somewhere where you keep your important information for, that you need to refer to when you're doing these types of reports or any filings that you're going to be doing with the FCC, because you'll use this FRN for your corporation more than one time when you're filing anything with the FCC. And as a good practice, I would also write the password that you use to log into the system to get your FRN and password, just so you'll remember it going forward. But this is the page. This is what the page looks like once you get assigned an FRN. Okay. Now this is the LMS page that you go to when you first want to complete your ownership report. Now, this is much different from CDBS that we used to use in prior years to complete the ownership report.
Right. So many of you who have done your own FCC filings have filed things in the past in CDBS. If there are television licensees on the phone, you've used LMS for some of your filings over the last year or so. But radio, this is really the entry point for radio into LMS. Eventually, all of the filings will be moving over into this new database that the FCC is using that gives the FCC more flexibility, gives them more searchability. It's a much more robust system than CDBS, but it's slowly being rolled out for radio. This is your first opportunity, radio guys, to use LMS.
And personal note, I like LMS. It's more user friendly. Once you get in and get familiar with the nuances, it's actually a lot of fun. So this is the first page that you will use to create your ownership report. You will log in using your FRN and password that you were just assigned from the core system.
Right, and that's going to be the licensee FRN and password that you want to use to log in, not some individual attributable owners.
Correct.
Information.
Correct. So once you've logged into the system, you'll click login, and it will take you to the next page, which is the page that you will use to actually pull down to the actual ownership report. You'll see on this page, you'll see the button that says File an Application. It's a drop down. And once you click on that drop down, you should all see it in the middle of your screen. It's highlighted in blue. Once you click on the drop down, you'll have choices of filing several applications, but you want to click the one that says Ownership Report, and you want to click the correct one, whether you're filing for a commercial or non-commercial ownership report, and whether or not you're filing a biannual ownership report or a non-biannual. So you need to pay attention to the choices that it's giving you, because you'll have 4 options. Just make sure you choose the correct one.
Right. And again, for this report that's due on March 2nd, it will be the biennial report. And if you're a commercial broadcaster, it'll be the biennial 323. If you're a non-commercial, it will be the biennial 323E. So don't pick the one that doesn't say biennial, because that's what we're filing here on March 2nd. By March 2nd is that biennial ownership report.
Right. So once you've chosen the correct form, you will now be able to navigate in completing the form. So I just wanted to also point out some differences in the commercial versus the non-commercial ownership report, the 323 versus the 323E. The 323E you do not have to include newspaper interest or family relationship questions, which we'll get to once we go further in the presentation.
Right. We'll be going through the Form 323 here in just a moment and looking at each of the questions. We're not going to do the 323E because we'll just be on the phone forever if we went through both forms line by line. But as Tracy said, you don't include any questions about newspaper interests. And why is that? It's because there is no non-commercial broadcast newspaper cross-ownership rule, and there never has been. So you don't have, it's not relevant to ownership interests for non-commercial entities. Why is there no discussion about family relationships on non-commercial broadcast reports? Beats me.
Me too.
It's just one of the things that the FCC has done differently for non-commercial reports than they have on commercial reports. So, but otherwise, the forms will be pretty much similar.
Yeah. So this is page 1 of the ownership report. And once you are on this page, once you enter your FRN and click enter, the respondent's name will populate. And by respondent, we mean the person that you're filing the ownership report for. And it's the same as the radio station owner. So once you enter the FRN and click submit, the respondent's name will automatically populate. What will not automatically populate will be the address information. You'll have to type all that information in, as well as the contact representative. Again, that should be someone who will be responsive to the FCC if they have questions or concerns about what you're about to put into this ownership report, or it can be your outside attorney or anyone else you deem fit to answer questions about the ownership report. The next section will be the application filing fee. For commercial stations, you will be paying a filing fee of $70 per station. And the way the question is worded is this application being submitted without a fee? You're going to answer no, because you are going to pay a filing fee. If for some reason you are not paying a filing fee, you would check yes, and then you would need to give the commission a reason you're not paying a filing fee. And those options are in the next section. Whether you're a government entity, you're fee exempt or other, and you need to provide an explanation for why you're not paying a fee.
Right, but generally for biennial ownership reports for any commercial entity, you're going to be filing a fee. So be careful reading these questions. As Tracy just pointed out, this is a question that's asked in the negative. Is the application being submitted without a filing fee? The answer is no, because you're submitting it with a filing fee, because as a commercial entity, you're required to submit it with a filing fee.
Right. So the next question is, provide the following information about the respondent. And you're going to answer as the licensee, because the first report you're going to file will be as the licensee, whether or not you have parent companies or not. You're going to file the first one for the licensee. So you would check the licensee box. Now, once you are ready to file the parent report, you would get the same you would do the same previous steps that I've already mentioned. But once you get to this question, you would answer entity. You would answer entity as a parent entity.
Right, which is the question, the box at the very bottom of this page. Entity required to file a Form 2100 Schedule 323 because it holds an attributable interest. So as Tracy just said, first you do the parent report where you're going to be checking the box here, licensee. Then once you've got the licensee, that's the actual name of the company that holds the license. If you've got a parent company or you've got an owner that's not an individual, a trust or some other legal entity, then you're going to have to file a second report, come back into the system, go through all the steps that Tracy just talked about, entering in the licensee information, get to this question 4, and click the box at the bottom, entity required to file a Form 2100 Schedule 323 because it holds an attributable interest, and that will give you the opportunity to create a second ownership report that provides all the information for this parent company entity.
Exactly. Now, the next set of questions, you're going to tell the commission what type of company you are. So you will check one of the options that apply to you. If you're a corporation, you would check for-profit corporation. If you're not-for-profit, which you would check not-for-profit, or if you're an LLC, you would check whatever applies to you. If you are completing this for a parent company and you are a trust, you would check other, and you would type in the box that you are a trust.
Right. So there are broadcasters who do have interests that are held by trusts. The trusts themselves would have to file reports to talk about who's making the voting decisions for the trust. Usually the trustee. There you would, if you're submitting a parent company report on behalf of a trust, you check the box other and provide an exhibit that describes what the entity is.
Yeah.
It's a trust with X number of trustees or whatever. Yeah. And how do you provide the exhibit, Tracy?
Well, it's a box that'll be next. Once you click other, a drop down will appear, and you just type in that box what the other means. It's straightforward. So on the next section will be the purpose of your application, of your report. And for this purpose, it's biennial. That is the first box, and that box is pre-filled. So you shouldn't have to complete anything once you're in the form. The system will know that it's a biennial report from when you originally selected the form from the drop-down. And then the next question is the as of date. And as David mentioned earlier, it's October 1st of 2017. That box is also pre-filled in the form. So you won't, there isn't anything for you to do there. You'll just see the box has October 1st already there.
Right, as Tracy said, when she talks about these boxes being pre-filled, once you have gotten to this page, and checked earlier in that drop-down menu that you're filing a biennial 323, the information should already be here. That number 1 should already be checked, that this is a biennial ownership report. And the effective date of October 1, which is the same effective date for every other person who is filing during this window, will also be pre-filled here. You won't have an option. You don't have to worry about responding to this question. If you get to this point and it's not pre-filled, that means you did something wrong earlier and didn't pick the right form.
Exactly. So in the next section is where you're going to enter the meat of the report, which is who the report is about. So the first section is the licensee name. Now also, it looks a little different here, but once you're actually in LMS, you will have to enter the FRN and the password for the licensee here. So you need to have that information handy, the FRN and password, because once you enter it here, it'll populate the company name that's associated with that FRN. So if there are any mistakes in the FRN and the licensee name, you would have to go back to CORS and correct those mistakes. Say you typed the company name and you spelled it wrong. You would have to go back to CORS, edit the information that's there, and then re-enter it here and it'll be corrected. So once you've populated the FRN and password and it's populated the licensee name, you will then tell it which call signs that you are filing this biennial ownership report for. And that brings me to another point. Once you've entered the FRN, the system would automatically bring in every call sign that's associated with that FRN. And it'll be a list of call signs that, that have been associated with that FRN, and you would choose the ones that you are filing this biennial ownership report for.
Now, a couple of things to note there. If you've been using the same FRN consistently for your licensee in the past, you should get a list of all the stations that you're currently is currently associated with that FRN that you currently own, would be listed here automatically once you've put the FRN number in. Now, some of those stations, if they weren't stations that you owned on October 1st, will have to be deselected. Some of those stations, if you've, would have to be deselected if you have acquired them since October 1. Some of them may not show up because they've been sold since October 1, but you need to add them back into the list.
Exactly.
If you've sold the station since October 1.
Yes. And the way that you would add them in, there's a drop down on the screen that it asks for facility ID number. And you should all be familiar with facility ID numbers because it's the number that the FCC uses along with your call sign. So if your call sign is WABC, your facility ID number is 123. You would enter 123.
Right. That facility ID number is a unique number that's associated with each of your separate stations. Even though the call letters of the station may change, that facility ID number stays the same. Even though your city of license may change at some point through a construction permit application, the facility ID number will change. Even though that station may be sold to somebody else, the facility ID number will stay the same. So that's a unique identifier that you should have for each of your stations.
Absolutely. So once you enter the facility ID number in the drop-down, the system will grab that call sign and it'll ask you, is this the call sign you were looking for? Next to the call sign and click add, and it'll add the call sign to the already call signs that you have selected in the drop-down box. So on the next slide, you would need to answer the questions. Is the respondent seeking an attributable exemption for any officer or director with duties wholly unrelated to the licensee or permittee?
Yeah, again, that's something, talk to your own attorney about. That's usually going to be a situation where you've got a big company that's got lots of officers and directors, and the company does, 6 different lines of business, and some of those officers and directors are totally associated with those other lines of business and have nothing to do with broadcasting. You would ask for an exemption for those people from having to report them, but that's something you talk over with your own attorney.
Okay. And then the next section is where you would enter those contracts that David was talking about earlier. You need to enter the description of the contract. If it's the LLC agreement or if it's the articles of incorporation, you need to type out what it is. In the next block, parties to the contract, usually the articles of incorporation are done with the state, whatever state that you're a part of, state of Michigan. That's where you would enter that. The date that you executed the articles of incorporation, that needs to go there. If there are expiration dates, you would need to enter them there. On most articles, there are no expiration dates, so you would check that box. And agreement type, you would enter again that it is the articles of incorporation, unless you're entering a contract for one of the options that are provided. If it's an LMA or JSA or network affiliation agreement, you would check those boxes. But if you are entering anything else, you would need to check other, and then you would have to type out what the other is.
Right, so that would be things like a pledge agreement, an option agreement, a security agreement, any of those kinds of documents that relate to ownership or control that we talked about earlier.
And if you have more than one agreement that you need to enter, the system will ask you, do you have other agreements to enter? You just keep checking the box until you've entered all the agreements that you need to enter.
Right, so this is a smart system that will keep prompting you as you're answering some of these questions where there are multiple things that you may have to list, whether it's additional stations or whether it's additional contracts. And when we get to ownership interests in the next page, additional owners, it will keep coming up saying, hey, do you need to add more people to this box? And if you hit yes, then you'll get another box to put in the next contract or the next owner. Then if you need to put in more, it'll ask you again, do you need to put in more? You hit yes, and you get another box to put in more people, and you keep doing that until you've provided all the contracts or all the owners here.
Okay. So in the next section is where we're going to enter the ownership interest of the people who are a part of this company. So here again, you would need to start off with their FRN, and of course, you've already taken care of getting them an FRN.
Remember, you've got a unique FRN for each individual because eventually it's going to make that individual searchable in this database so that researchers or the FCC can find out what that individual attributable owner owns in the way of other broadcast interests across all of the FCC's databases.
Correct. Now, again, once you enter their FRN, you don't have to enter the password, just the FRN here. And once you click enter, the name of that person who is a part, who that FRN is associated with will populate. But again, you'll need to enter their address, you need to enter the city and state and zip code here. And you'll need to tell the system what type of interest holder this is, whether or not it's the respondent or other interest holder. And more than likely, the respondent always comes up first. So you've already entered their information.
Right. The respondent would basically be the licensee on the licensee report, or if you're doing a parent company report, the respondent is the parent company. And then you put in the parent company's name, whether it's a trust or an LLC or whatever, and then you list the owners of that parent company. Or for the licensee, you put in the licensee's name in the first box, and then you put in all the attributable owners, officers, and directors of that licensee company.
Right. So for this one, we're going to say we're entering a person. So you would need to check all of their positional interests. If they're an officer, if they're a director, you check all the boxes that are applicable to the person that you're entering this portion of the form about.
Yeah, a couple of weird ones here. Attributable creditor. What does that mean? That's basically a situation. There's something called the FCC's Equity Debt Plus rule, where if you've loaned a station more than 33% of its financing, and you also either provide a significant amount of programming to that station or have another station in the same market, you're an attributable creditor who has to be listed on this report. Attributable investor would be an LLC member or a limited partner who is not insulated, where your partnership agreement or LLC agreement doesn't have that magic language we talked about earlier that insulates those investors. Most of these others, I think, are going to be relatively straightforward as to who you're going to be listing.
Right. So the next set of questions is where you need to enter your citizenship, the gender, the ethnicity, and the race of the person that you're completing this portion of the form for. Now, if this is for a company, obviously you would not enter their gender, it's gender, but none of these questions will show up if you are entering it for a company, because the system will know by that FRN that this is not a person, this is a company. So again, this is another check. If you get here and you're entering for a company, something is wrong.
Right. If those boxes on gender and ethnicity show up and you're trying to do it for a company, you've done something wrong at some point earlier in the process. One other question that may come up for non-commercial stations that are listening to the webinar here. Some of you have no doubt read that you do not need to get an FRN for all of your officers and directors. You can use something called a special use FRN or an SUFRN for each of your owners, and that's because the FCC was worried about trying to get Social Security numbers and other personally identifiable information from people like the governor who may sit on the board of a state university who runs a radio or TV station or something like that. You don't have to get their Social Security number to get an FRN. You can just create an SUFRN, and you create that directly on the form 323E. Again, we're not going to show you that, but there will be a box where you can create that. Note, though, that SUFRN is supposed to be used by the individual whose interest you're reporting on. That same SUFRN is supposed to be used by them in all the different licensees in which they may have an interest. So if, for instance, the governor is a member of the board of 6 different state universities, all of which you have broadcast stations who are separately reporting separate licensees, that governor should be using the same SUFRN on all 6 licensees' reports. Or if there's another member of your board of directors who is on the board of directors of other nonprofit companies, that same SUFRN should be passed on to the other companies in which he or she has an interest.
Exactly. All right, next page. Again, this is where you would check your race. That applies. Tribal nation or tribal entity. There should be a no there too. So you would check yes or no. Now, interest percentages is where you would enter the voting shares of the person that you're entering this portion of the form for. Now, on this section, you need to enter it as, if they have 10%, you need to enter 10.0. You need to add the 0.0 or you will get an error message. In that, once you get your check, once you go through and check the form, it'll tell you that you made an error, and the error is you need to have 10.0.
So you have to go to the first decimal place.
Exactly. And the next question is, does the interest holder have an attributable interest in one or more broadcast stations that do not appear on this report? This is what David was talking about earlier, where we used to have to list all of your other broadcast interests in a spreadsheet for all the other radio stations that you had interest in. We don't need to do that anymore. We just need to answer yes or no. And again, it's because we're going to be able to track what other stations you have interest in by your FRN.
Right. So somebody who is researching this is looking at this ownership report once it's filed in the FCC system, and they're looking at John Jones, and they note that he has checked yes, that John Jones has interest in other broadcast stations. Then they'll theoretically be able to search John Jones and be able to come up with all the interest that he has in all of his other broadcast stations without you having to add attachments or otherwise listing all those interests in this particular report.
Exactly. So the next question, respondent certifies that any interest, including equity, financial, or voting interest not reported in response to question 2A are non-attributable. And you would answer yes, because you told the commission everything that you know or need to know about this report that you're filing.
Right, so basically this is just a certification that you figured out who all those attributable owners are in your company, and that you've done ownership reports or otherwise listed them on the appropriate ownership reports and filed those with the commission.
Okay. And the next question is asking you if you have any interest in any newspapers. And if you do, you would click yes, and the drop-down will ask you about the ownership that you have in that newspaper.
Right, and that would be daily newspapers in your market. And in fact, eventually this question in another month is likely to be obsolete because the newspaper broadcast cross ownership rules have been done away with unless those rules are stayed. But we'll see in the next month whether they go into effect or not.
Okay. That's the drop down you would see about the newspaper in the first section. Now, the second part of this page is asking you, are any of the attributable interest holders related? And if you answer yes, you're going to need to tell the commission how they're related by entering their FRN, and you need to tell them what the relationship is, whether they're a spouse, whether it's a parent-child, or whether they're siblings. So once you enter the FRN, the system will also populate their names. So all you need to enter is the relationship and their FRN, and the system will put the name in, and once you click enter, you'll see the names pop up, and if there's more than one relationship, it'll ask you, do you have more relationships to enter? And you can keep entering until you get to all the relationships that are involved in this report.
Right, so that's if you've got father and son, mother and daughter, husband and wife who are attributable owners. The FCC wants to know the familiar relationships between those parties in this question. The question after that is, again, the question we've been talking about. If you've got corporate officers that have nothing to do with the broadcast station and you don't want to report them, this is where you've got that exemption. And once again, they ask about that there.
Now, here's what you want to see. You want to see all green check marks. If there's anything red showing up here, actually, if you make a mistake in a section, the system will prompt you to stay on that page until you fix it, but sometimes you need to get other information or come back to it. You can click a different section of the form by clicking one of these hyperlinks here, and it'll take you to whatever other section of the form you want to complete at that time. But you will not be able to complete the form until you see all these green check marks. And that's what you want.
Right, so in other words, you can go back and forth between different sections of the form, completing them one at a time, but the FCC won't let you file the form until you've completed all the appropriate sections. you'll see these green check marks lining up, looking beautiful, and then you'll go to the next page that we'll show you in just a moment. What happens if you haven't done something? What's this going to look like?
You'll have a red check mark red X next to it.
X. So if you see that red X, you got to go back to that section and figure out what you've done wrong.
Right. So this is the very last page of the form. This is the certification page. This is where you would enter the name of the person certifying the report. Usually it's the president or someone with authority who can certify that everything in the report is correct. You would enter their title there. You would enter the name of the respondent, which is the licensee, another way for saying licensee.
Or the parent company.
Or the parent company, depending on which one you're filling it out for. And you would type in the name of the president or the person certifying the report and their last name and enter the phone number and click submit. And once you click submit, you will also be prompted to pay the fee. And the fee is $70 per station. So if you've got 3 stations, that's $210. So for every station, it's $70, and that's.
And how will you pay the fee?
You can pay the fee by credit card. There's a link next to, once you click submit application, it'll ask you if you want to pay the fee right then and there. You click the button that says pay fee, and it'll take you to the fee filer system, which is another database for the FCC. If you're paying by credit card, you click the credit card link and enter the information of your credit card and hit submit, and it'll take your money right then and there. And you'll get a receipt, and it'll reference the file number of the ownership report on your receipt, so you can keep all your documents together. And you're complete.
Great. So that's the story on ownership reports. There is a chat box on your screen that if you've got some questions, you can shoot us a chat. Otherwise, my contact information is here on the screen, my email and telephone number. Also putting in a plug for my blog, broadcastlawblog.com, where I cover a lot of the issues about what's up for broadcasters, put out some reminders as to what you need to know about some of the things that are you should be keeping track of in the broadcast legal world. So hopefully we've provided you some information in the hour. Look at that, 1:59, exactly an hour that we've done here. I don't see any questions in the chat box, so if you've got questions, feel free to send me an email, and Tracy or I will get back to you later on. Thanks so much for listening, and I believe the Michigan Association will make this PowerPoint available to folks who participated upon request, or you can send me an email and I'll send it your way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.